Welcome to Myth Madness. 2 episodes ago, I told the story of Rostam's adventures in the Div homeland, Mazandaran. Rostam was there on a rescue operation, as the king of Iran, Kay Kavus, had found himself captured by the demons. This was Kay Kavus' own fault. He was easily tricked by the evil spirit Ahriman into invading Mazandaran, the magical and dangerous homeland of the Divs. Kay Kavus' problem was that no matter how great his lineage was, or how justly he ruled, or how wide his kingdom spread across the world, Kavus was fundamentally a fool. The failed invasion of Mazandaran was the first critical example. This episode, which will be a shorter one, will cover 2 more examples of Kay Kavus' foolishness that are recorded in the Shahnameh epic poem. The first involves a woman named Sudabeh, and the second again involves the mischief of Divs. Here goes. Besides Iran, Kay Kavus was the overlord of many other lands. One day he decided to go on an extended tour of his entire kingdom. While he was traveling, a rebellion led by 3 kings broke out in the lands bordering the Red Sea. When Kay Kavus learned of this, he quickly broke off his travels and led his army to the seashore. The army boarded ships and set off to reinforce Kay Kavus' allies. When they arrived, a great battle followed, and the 3 enemy armies were overwhelmed by the Persians. The first enemy leader to surrender was the king of a land called Hamavaran, or Hamavaron. It's not entirely clear what land this actually was, but scholarly consensus is it's a kingdom in Yemen. Anyway, the king of Hamavaron offered Kavus a rich tribute of horses, weapons, jewels, and crowns if Kavus accepted his surrender and put him under his protection. Kay Kavus planned to agree when one of his advisors took him aside and told him about the king of Hamavaron's beautiful daughter. She had lovely black hair and lips as sweet as sugarcane. Kay Kavus was excited, and he sent a diplomat to the king of Hamavaron. He offered the king his requested alliance, but in exchange he asked to marry the other king's daughter. When the king of Hamavaron heard Kavus' demand, he was deeply saddened. Kay Kavus had already taken his wealth, and now he wanted his only daughter too. The king of Hamavaron had nothing else for Kavus to take. He did not want to agree, but he knew his kingdom could not withstand the war with the Persians that would inevitably follow his refusal. So he told the messenger he would agree to Kavus' demand. The king of Hamavaron then summoned his daughter Sudabeh to tell her about Kay Kavus. He asked Sudabeh what her opinion was. Sudabeh was shrewd and recognized she really had no choice. She told her father to make something of it, and an alliance with Kay Kavus was not something to be sad about. With Sudabeh's agreement, Kay Kavus began to prepare for the wedding. Camels, slaves, mules, and horses. Thousands of camels loaded with rich cloth. The bride rode in a litter and was accompanied by warriors, dressed in the finest colorful clothes. When Kay Kavus finally saw Sudabeh, with her rich ruby lips and flower eyes, he stared at her in amazement. She was truly worthy to be his bride, and the marriage happily went ahead. However, a week passed, and the king of Hamavaron missed his daughter terribly. He thought up a scheme that would allow him to regain his daughter and get out of paying Kavus' tribute. He invited Kay Kavus to come stay as his guest during a great festival. However, his daughter realized what her father was planning. She told Kavus that he should not return to Hamavaron. Her father would try and have him killed. But Kay Kavus did not believe her, and so he and his nobles set out to join the king of Hamavaron at a city called Shahnameh. When he arrived, the inhabitants of the city all came out into the street and bowed to Kavus. They scattered jewels and saffron on the ground in front of him. Once at the palace, Kavus sat on a throne, and the king of Hamavaron served him wine and stood next to him like a servant. This was all according to plan. The king of Hamavaron secretly sent a message to his old rebel allies. They quickly came to Shahnameh, captured Kay Kavus and his warrior captains Gudars, Giv, and Tus. They imprisoned the Persians in a fortress high up on the slopes of a mountain. The warriors stole all of Kavus's gold and took Sudabeh and her female servants back to the king of Hammurabi. When Sudabeh saw how she and her handmaidens were being marched away like slaves, she tore her hair and scratched her face. She cried and screamed. She called them liars and oath-breakers, who ambushed their guests because they could not handle him on the field of battle. She said that even if Kay Kavus died, she would still remain his wife. When the king of Hammurabi heard this, he was so mad he sent Sudabeh to join Kay Kavus as a prisoner in the mountain fortress. The king of Hammurabi's capture of Kay Kavus caused a series of problems back in Persia. With the king out of the picture, numerous claimants for the throne began jostling for power, giving bribes to secure support. And Persia's old enemy kingdom, Turan, once so wild but since asleep, woke up. The prince of Turan, Afrasiab, gathered his army and invaded Persia once again. Without its king and capable commanders, the Persian army was crushed, and Afrasiab captured many men, women, and children. Castles were sacked and homes burnt to the ground. A number of refugees traveled to Sistan and begged Zal and Rostam to save them. Rostam heard them and cried at the news of Persia's fall. He promised to prepare for war and rid all of Iran of its invaders. First, Rostam sent a message to the king of Hammurabi. He accused the king of breaking his oath to Kay Kavus. He told him to release Kavus or fight against Rostam. The king of Hammurabi did not listen. He replied that he would not release Kay Kavus, and if Rostam came to Hammurabi, he would be welcomed with the sharp end of a sword. That concluded the negotiations. Rostam gathered his army and marched them to the borders with Hammurabi. His Sistani troops began to pillage the towns and countryside. The king of Hammurabi led his own army out, but when they saw how big and strong Rostam was, they fled away from the battlefield. The king of Hammurabi asked for reinforcements from his rebel allies, telling them that only together could they defeat Rostam. When the other two armies arrived, Rostam and the Iranians were greatly outnumbered. To secure victory, Rostam rode out and ignored the warriors, focusing instead on finding the enemy kings as they fought on the battlefield. In this way, Rostam rode through lines of enemy troops, found each king, defeated them and their bodyguards, and tied each king up. Without their leaders, the enemy armies surrendered. After the battle, Rostam had the captured king of Hammurabi brought out. In exchange for his freedom, Rostam had him promise to release Kay Kavus and the other Persian heroes from the mountain fortress. A now free Kay Kavus led the army and Sudabeh back to Persia. When Rostam told him about Afrasiab's latest invasion, Kay Kavus sent Afrasiab a letter demanding he leave Iran and return to Turan. But Afrasiab replied in the negative. He told Kay Kavus he was prepared for war, and he claimed Iran was rightfully his, as he was a descendant of Feridun and had already overcome the Persian army through force of arms. In other words, might makes right. It was tough talk that he ultimately didn't back up. Kay Kavus led the army against him, and Afrasiab was defeated yet again. 2/3 of his warriors were killed, and he was forced to retreat back to Turan. For his part in saving the king and also saving Persia, Kay Kavus declared that Rostam was the Jahan Pahlavan, or champion of all the world. This meant he was the preeminent Persian hero serving the king. Before continuing, I want to talk a little bit about Afrasiab and his short-lived invasion of Iran while Kay Kavus was imprisoned, and bring in some material from the Zoroastrian religious texts that predate the Shahnameh. Kay Kavus is present in those texts, although Rostam is not. Some version of the events in Hammurabi and the part played by Afrasiab might be. According to the Bundahishni, the Deves tricked Kavus and got him imprisoned in a land called Shambaran. While he was gone, the throne of Iran was captured by a monstrous man named Zanagav, who was the grandfather of the old world tyrant Zahak. Zanagav possessed a poisonous eye that he used to devastate his opposition. However, At this point, Afrasiab led his army out of Turan, killed Zanagav, not clear how, and took over Iran. So, for a very brief moment, Afrasiab was king, until Kay Kavus returned and forced his enemies to leave. In this Bundahishni tale, Afrasiab is presented like a hero. You can see why this is a strange story, and it does not appear in the Shahnameh. In the Bundahishni, Afrasiab was even said to temporarily possess the Far of Iran. In other words, the Creator's divine blessing, conferring his right to rule. Anyway, back to the Shahnameh. After Kay Kavus returned to Persia, it wasn't too long before the Iranians got another example of his foolishness. Although, to Kavus' credit, this trouble wasn't entirely his own making. As mentioned in this episode's introduction, he once again fell for tricks played by Deves. One morning, the evil spirit Ahriman, or the Muslim devil Eblis, depends on the translation, held a council of demons. He declared that the reign of Kay Kavus was a miserable time for the Deves. Ahriman asked for a volunteer. He wanted a Deve who was well versed in court etiquette, who could go to Kay Kavus and poison his mind so he would lose the royal far granted to him by the Creator. One of the demons agreed. He transformed himself into a handsome human youth and set out for Persia. When the king was out hunting, the youth appeared, bowed to Kay Kavus, and gave him a beautiful bouquet of flowers. He praised the king and told him the entire earth was his to command. The king was wise and rich and just. He was greater than the other kings who came before him. But there was just one thing left. He had not learned the secrets of sky and sun. Kay Kavus was tricked by the demon and could think of nothing else. How would he learn the secrets of sky and sun? He asked learned men and sages how he could fly without wings. Finally, he ordered men to go out at night and rob eagles' nests of their eggs and chicks. The young eagles were raised in special houses, fed on diets of fowl and lamb. When they were older and big and strong, Kay Kavus had a throne, built of wood and gold, and had the eagles tied to it. Kay Kavus had meat skewered on the tip of a long lance. He had the lance suspended above the eagles, and they, in their hunger, flew upwards towards it, pulling on their leashes and carrying the throne and the king high into the air. Ahriman's trick was about to be sprung. The eagles carried Kay Kavus through the sky. They couldn't do this forever, though. When they grew too tired, the throne crashed to the ground. Fortunately for the king, he landed in a thick mass of trees and brush, softening his landing and preventing his death. But Kay Kavus was humiliated, and he prayed to the Creator for forgiveness. Fortunately for Kay Kavus, Rostam, Giv, Gudars, and Tus were already searching for him. You could say that they were doing it reluctantly. They thought Kay Kavus was a complete fool. And Gudars, specifically, wondered if this latest dramatic example showed that Kavus was so unwise he wasn't fit to be king. In fact, when they finally did find Kay Kavus, Gudars could not help himself. He lectured Kay Kavus and asked him if he belonged in a hospital instead of a palace. This was the third time Kay Kavus had got himself into trouble. First, there was the attempted conquest of Mazandaran. Then, there was the time he ignored all advice and fell into the king of Hamaveron's trap. And now, there was this attempt to fly through the sky like a madman. Kay Kavus was shamed by Gudars' words, and he could not help but agree. The king was carried back to his palace in a litter, depressed and thinking only of his regret. When he arrived, Kay Kavus sequestered himself in his palace. He did not hold feasts or have audiences with his subjects. He only wept and prayed. His only orders were to distribute wealth to the poor in his absence. Time passed, and Kay Kavus emerged from his isolation humbled. The Creator had forgiven him, and his sense of justice had returned. As with this episode's other story, two Zoroastrian texts, the Bundahishni and the Denkard, also allude to some earlier form of this story. Once again, blame initially rests with the Deves. One of them, Asma, the Zoroastrian demon of wrath whispers lies to Kay Kavus, the earlier version of Kay Kavus. The demon convinces him that the 7 continents of the earth are not enough to rule, and that he should conquer the heavens too. Instead of trying to fly, like the Kay Kavus in the Shahnameh, this Kay Kavus gathers an army of Deevs and men and marches up the side of the Alborz mountain, the central mountain of the world in Zoroastrian cosmology. The Zoroastrian creator, or Mazd, intervened. Kay Kavus and his army were wiped off and fell off the mountain. But Kay Kavus was not killed, landing in the sea. It was the creator's will that he would father someone special, and the foolish king had not done that yet. Interestingly, in the Bundahishni, this story is actually what happens to Kay Kavus right before he is imprisoned in Sham-Baran, thus reversing the order of events presented in the Shahnameh. These 2 stories show the links that were still present between the earlier Zoroastrian story traditions and the medieval epic poems that followed after the conquest of Persia by the Arabs. Over time, details were changed, and the order to plot events was switched, but you can see many of the essential nuggets of the story remained. And that's all for this episode. Join me next time when I continue with another story from the Shahnameh epic poem. Thank you for listening.